how far are you advancing against the current? You see, there's all these things that are running against us, up to and including that maybe we don't know the real rate of return of our mutual fund. Maybe we're not calculating the fact we lost some real money on our balance sheet in our early years. Maybe not counting the fact we made some bad purchasing decisions that have cost us real money on our balance sheet. And we don't know how fast we're moving in an absolute manner. It's like are you advancing by 10% a year, or are you losing ground? And if you don't have a third party you're working with, a coach that's looking at all of those things, you're going to miss that. In fact, I've met the first client ever, Corey, who has been listening to the podcast, was introduced by a friend of theirs that's already a client. Only
Nice.
person I've ever met who every 2 weeks has built his entire personal balance sheet in Excel. Very admirable. Like actually counting up.
Really admirable.
Really, like,
Oh my gosh.
people don't do that. Like that is, and by the way, and he says, and I don't know if I'm actually advancing or not. And he's actually every 2 weeks leaving his business value, which is significant, and just bought out some partners. So like he knows the value, leaves it off his personal balance sheet. Also super admirable. Now for us, we look at that and go, okay, so how are you advancing? This weekend, I got, for those of you that are into fishing and kayaking, etc., I just got used, because I refused to buy a new one. It took me 2 years to find one at the price point I wanted, a Hobie Mirage Drive tandem fishing kayak. Now, for those of you that don't know, and if you're watching the show right now, instead of just listening, the Mirage Drive on the bottom of it has these 2 fins that work back and forth that help you go really, really fast for a kayak.
You're pedaling.
You're
right?
pedaling.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. And then these fins go back and forth on the bottom instead of having to use a paddle. And my daughter, who's super adventurous, she's the youngest. She turned 7 this year. She jumped in the kayak with me, wanted to go fishing with Dad. So off we go. And we saw some great stuff. We went by these little islands. We were in a place called Wanapum Lake in Vantage, Washington, which is kind of in the center of Washington. We went by these little islands. We got to see a deer swim from one island to another, which was super cool, and see the deer once it was on land. We then went ahead and did some fishing under the bridge, went all the way over these petrified forest remains that are kind of on the bank there, turned around, came back. All in, it was about 4.5 hours. But what I could tell in certain parts of the lake, because it is the Columbia River being held back by a dam, is I could feel the current in certain areas. Now, the fortunate part is I had this Mirage Drive that was moving me fast enough to overcome the current. Like if I would have just been paddling, meaning not moving as fast, or in this case, a lower rate of return, I would have had no advancement. It would have not only, like we just couldn't have been out there that long, because we would have been pushed back and had an inability to actually enjoy our trip because we just weren't moving fast enough. That you have to be moving fast enough to at least overcome the eroding factors coming back at you. You could literally end up with zero like speed as it relates to, speed over land is what we would say in flying. But in this case,
flying, like an airplane has to get a certain critical velocity or it never takes off. Like you could just keep going on the runway until you run out of runway. If you don't hit a certain critical speed early enough, you're never getting off into the air and gaining elevation.
Exactly right. And so for us, with this little adventure, is like we just had to go fast enough to overcome the current to enjoy our time. We didn't need to go a lot faster to current, but we needed to be advancing. And kudos to Vivian, because she stayed out there with me for like 4.5 hours, reapplying sunblock, bug spray, fishing, not getting fish. She did sleep for the last hour on the way back, but she was a trooper the rest of the time. But you had an experience like that, actually not far from that in Concrete,
Yeah,
Washington.
just in Concrete, it was October. It was way too late to be jumping into a river. It was super cold. So we decided we were going to swim across this pretty fast river. And about halfway across, my brain did the math. Like, wait, this is miserable already. If I make it to the other side, I still have to come back. And so I was like, okay, I'm just turning around.
You have to come back and walk up shore on the other side enough to overcome how you slipped going there.
Right.
And correct for how much you're going to slip going back. So you'd have to walk like 600 yards up the other side of the river.
And I was working so hard, not even opposing the river, just trying to go across the current. So just turning around to go back the other way I don't know, 300 yards downstream before I could get all the way back to the side that I started on. So it's real that, in our financial lives, having to make that headway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got the current of maybe not knowing the real return of the things we're putting money into. By the way, the real problem is that we don't know the real return of the ones we miss, so we have a bigger degree of FOMO, fear of missing out.
Right.
And when we're newly going into an investment, we don't, as they would have said, ancients ago, you must count the cost first. That we're not fully counting the cost first, the full impact first. So for you, as you listen today, what can you do? Well, it's not super complicated. One, know the costs and the real returns of the things you're going to do before you go in, both the internal and external rates of return. Meaning you might go into an investment, you might go into an asset that puts you in the position that it looks like it has a great rate of return in and of itself, but it may have other factors around it that increase cost to you, and you should be aware of them. For instance, like the real estate. On the price and the value of it and climbing, it looks like it's doing really great. But once you count some of the other costs, it cuts the return nearly in half. That might still be okay with you, but you should know that in advance, not live in the fantasy of the uncorrected rate of return if it just feels like my money would have tripled in real estate if it would have been there. Second, you need to be in a position that you're working with somebody that can actually help you understand where you might be leaking money from your bucket over time. In our philosophy conversation, we talk all the time that you building up your money is a little bit like trying to walk up a river. You're scooping some out of the river, you're having to drink it. That's like your consumption as you live your life. And you're also storing some up in a bucket that's going to survive you when you get out of the river one day so that you can live off it when you're no longer in your career, when you no longer own your business. That's all well and good. But if that bucket is leaking, if there's real drag on your return, real drag on your balance sheet, it is costing you. And I'm not just talking about money. If your balance sheet is currently 20% inefficient, that's 20% of baseball games you didn't have to miss, 20% of anniversaries you didn't have to miss, 20% of great vacations with friends and family that you had to sit out on because you needed to work, because you needed to be in your business. Why? Because it was your balance sheet that was inefficient, meaning your inefficient balance sheet, not counting all of these costs, not knowing the true autobiography of your money can actually be costing you part of life. It's not just about money, it's the life that you get to live outside of it. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe, ring that bell, and when you get a moment, pick up my book on Amazon, Sound Financial Advice. It's the kind of book that's easy to read, but hard to forget all the knowledge you learned.